Now we're going to go on to talk about the matter concerning al-mu'tada when her menstruation discontinues before her customary norm. For example, sometimes when a woman, or mu'tada, a woman who has a norm, sometimes her menses will stop and then continue again. So we're going to discuss the issue of what a woman is supposed to do when her menses comes and goes. For example, she has a duration, a custom duration of 7 days, and on the third day her menses cuts, she washes, and then she starts to pray again, and then 2 days later her menstruation comes back. Is that considered a new menses, or is that considered the continuation of her menses from the blood that cut 2 days before? If we say that it's a new menses, then some rules, there are particular rules that pertain to it, and if we say that it's continuing, then other rules pertain to it. So in Al-Akhdari it says, if menses discontinues, then she must combine the days together until they add up to the number of her customary menstrual cycle. Alright, and we're going to go on to explain that by saying, if a woman has a customary cycle of 7 days, and it happens that during her menses the blood stops on the third day. Okay, so that's the scenario that we have here, that her menstrual cycle, or her customary cycle, is 7 days, but the blood stops on the third day. What is she supposed to do? The answer, then the rule is that if the blood returns, she is requested to join the first 3 days of menses before the blood stopped to the 4 more days of the returning blood in order to complete her custom duration. What do we mean here is, if she bleeds for the first 3 days and then the blood stops, as soon as that blood comes back, she's going to add 4 more days. And why is she going to add 4 more days? We mentioned in order to complete her custom duration. Now the next sentence after this is very important, because we say this rule only applies if there were not 15 days between the time the blood stopped and the time that it returned. So this rule that we just mentioned is only going to apply if there hasn't been 15 days between the time the blood cut to the time that the blood returned. So for example, if her menstruation cuts on the third day, and it comes back, and the blood comes back before 15 days, then when that blood comes back, it's going to be considered part of the first menses, and that's why she's going to join the rest of her days to the days that she bled before. But if it comes after, the meaning of this is that if the blood comes back after 15 days, then that's not going to be considered part of her first menses, but instead it's going to be considered a new menses. So a general rule is, any returning blood before 15 days is from the first menses, and anything after 15 days that returns is considered a new menses. So that means every woman whose blood cuts before her norm, she needs to mark down the days on her calendar from the next day when the blood cut. So for example, if her blood cut on the third day, the next day on the fourth day she's going to count that as the first day. Then the second and the third, all the way up to 15 days. If the blood comes back on the 16th day, then it's considered a new menses. If it comes back before that, then it's considered part of her menses, and so she's going to add the rest of the days until she completes her norm. Likewise, we gave an example of if it cuts one time. Same issue if a woman was to bleed one day, and then it was to stop for 2 days, and then she was to bleed again and then stop for another 2 days, and to bleed again and stop for another 2 days, she is going to keep on adding those days to her menses as long as there's not 15 days between, as long as there has not occurred 15 days between the two cuttings of the blood. Right? So another example. Let's say she bled on the first day, and then her blood cut for 7 days, and then it came back. Okay, so now that it came back, she has 2 days, and then it cuts again, and so she waits 10 days, and then the blood comes back. So now she has menses for 3 days. Don't count all those days in between those 15 days and think because they all added up, if the blood comes back again, then it's considered a new menses. No. As long as 15 days has not occurred between the continuing and the return of the blood, then that blood is going to be considered part of the first menses. So, to give you one more clear example, if she was to bleed for 4 days, and then the blood was to stop, for example, and then 14 days was to pass, and then the blood was to come back, and she bled for 1 more day, and then another 14 days were to pass, and then the blood was to come back again, she's still going to gather those days, regardless of if all those days add up to 28, because the important part is to look at the days that occur between the starting of the blood, between the stopping of the blood and the returning of the blood. And so we strike an example of this at the bottom, where we say, example, if a woman has a normal cycle of 7 days, but 1 month she bled for only 3 days, okay, and then the blood stopped, then before 15 days passed, the blood returned. So you already understand why we said before 15 days passed, the blood returned. At this point, she is requested to combine 4 more days from the returning blood to 3 days she bled before the blood stopped. And why is she going to do that? In order to complete her customary cycle, which we said is 7 days. On the contrary, if the blood were to return after 15 days, then she would not combine them at all, because this new bleeding is considered a new menses. So anything that comes after 15 days is considered a new menses. And I think, as I mentioned already before, but I made a note here at the bottom, saying an important note to make here is that whenever the blood stops, then she is considered to be pure, which means she must perform the ritual washing, al-ghusl as it's called in Arabic, pray and fast. What do we mean by that? She should not assume that because, for example, she bled for 3 days and it stopped, right? And so she knows, okay, it's going to come back before 15 days because that's what generally happens to her. She doesn't say, okay, I'm not going to pray and I'm not going to fast, I'll wait until my blood comes back so that I can finish my cycle. No. Any time blood stops, or the menstruation stops, meaning that she comes out of menses, she's going to wash, make a ghusl, pray, and fast, and it is also permissible for her to have relations with her wife. It's also permissible for a husband to have relations with her, and it's also permissible for her to have relations with her husband. And so, but if the blood comes back, then obviously she cannot have relations, nor does she fast, and nor does she pray. So once again, that's why we say an important note to make here is that whenever the blood stops, then she's considered to be pure, which means she must perform the ritual washing, pray, and fast. It is also permissible for her to have relations with her husband, although when the blood returns, this is no longer the case because she has returned to menses. And because she has returned to menses, then praying and fasting is, she doesn't pray and she doesn't fast, and her husband cannot have relations with her. And before we finish here, another important issue here is when we say that a woman has menses and it cuts and it begins, we don't mean that a woman should be bleeding 24/7 of a day in order for it to be considered menses, as we mentioned before. Because in general cases, women are not bleeding all the time, right? And in the next lesson, we'll discuss the matter of what are the signs that a woman has come out of menses, so that she knows whether or not she's still considered in menstruation or not. So, just as a quick note one more time, we don't mean when we say that a woman is bleeding, that she's bleeding 24/7 in her menstruation, which will be clear in the next class, inshallah. And so we'll stop here. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.